You're listening to the Leadership and Theology with a Cup of Joe podcast. Today I'm with Dr. Richard Park. He is the founder and president of the Renaissance Group, which strives to connect calling to culture. And today we'll be talking about discerning your calling. Let's take a drink. You're listening to the Leadership and Theology with a Cup of Joe podcast. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I know that your wife just gave birth to your first son.
That's right.
So it means a lot that you would take time out of your busy schedule and be with us. Tell us a little bit about your role with the Renaissance Group and how it came about.
Yeah, sure. So I actually helped found the group back in 2017. So I'm currently the president and founder, and the reason we started it off was actually, like, rewind 15 years before that. I was teaching high school. I was just teaching history at a public high school and enjoying that. And as I often like to say, I had students walking in, a lot of my guy students wearing clothes that were like just off the wall, in a lot of different ways. And then maybe some of the female students wearing, maybe, as I like to say, like not enough clothes, right? And so really, as a result of that, I thought, we are what we wear. And so why don't we create a culture that kind of reflects what we really want to be and see? And as a result of that, I did what any high school teacher would do, which is I started a clothing company. So I actually started a t-shirt and hoodies kind of graphic tee kind of company, and we just wanted to, we think that people end up becoming what they're beholding. Mm-hmm. And if we constantly are beholding things, whether it's on each other or on social media, wherever, we're going to become that kind of people. So our thinking was, why don't we create a culture of beauty so that we can create beautiful people, right? And then the last part of that is, well, in order to do that, we need every artist, engineer, elementary school teacher, whatever, pastor, so on and so forth, to be excellent in their calling in order to create that beautiful culture. So that's what we're all about, helping people find their calling.
That's awesome. Now, I know for me as a college student, we feel the pressure that during college, it's that grind time to figure out our calling in life. What exactly is a calling?
That's a great question. In essence, I like to think of it as your why, right? There's a guy named Simon Sinek. He wrote a book called Start With Why. There's a comedian. His name was Micheal Jr. He's a Christian comedian, but he has a YouTube a video called Know Your Why. And basically, he has this guy who's like, he's just talking to people in the audience, and he's a high school music teacher, this guy Daryl. And so he's like, okay, Daryl. He's like, can you sing? Kind of just playing with him, right? He's like, why don't you sing for us Amazing Grace? So he sings a song, and it's pretty darn good, right? And then he goes, and this is like in front of like 25,000 people at Gateway Church in Texas. And then he goes, okay, now I want you to sing Amazing Grace like you were shot in the back when you were a kid. Your uncle just got out of jail. He just starts going for it, right? He's like, give me the hood, the ghetto version if you have it, So he sings it, and you got to check it out on YouTube. But it's just incredible the way he sings it, right? To the point where I would say like 90% of all 20,000 people are like on their feet. They're, it's just incredible. So he goes, here's the point why I want you to sing. He says, the first time I asked you to sing, you knew what you were doing. But the second time I asked you to sing, you knew why. And purpose or calling is knowing your why. And that's why I think it's so important to like as you're saying, college students like, oh, why am I taking this class, or why am I majoring in this? It should all be asked, why are you doing it? Because it's got to feed into your ultimate purpose for what God has put you here on earth for. Yeah. So I think calling is critical to everything we do in life.
Now, some people may oftentimes get confused. Is calling the same thing as a job?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I honestly believe that calling is bigger than a job, because we're also called to be a spouse. Eventually, one day, for some of us already, we're called to be a good neighbor. We're called to be a good customer at Starbucks, instead of like being rude. So I think calling involves literally everything from our, as I like to say, our 9 to 5, our job, but also our 5 to 9. Like, what do we do with the rest of our time? Like, all of that is our calling. It's to represent Christ well wherever we go. So I think calling has an occupational aspect to it, but I think calling is much more than just, what's my job? It's your purpose, not your profession, if you put it that way. Yeah.
That's so good. Your purpose, not your profession. Now, how does someone find their calling?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, so you got to either come to Vanguard University, take my elective class, or you could go to the REN, our website, and then check out our online course. But honestly, it's not easy. I have friends who I walk with, folks who are in their 20s, folks who are in their 40s, and folks, even a gentleman who's in his 60s. He and I have been meeting regularly for a while. As he's like, Rich, I still don't know what I was born for, And that's a reality. A lot of people go into school, grad school, whatever, get their job, and they work for 10, 20 years, and they wake up at 40 years old, and they're like, what am I doing with my life?
Yeah.
I got a nice house, a family, 2 kids, whatever, but I don't know what I'm doing except just getting a paycheck. But that life is more than a paycheck, right? So they're wrestling with it at that point. But it's cool that you're thinking about this early on. It's cool that any student at this age, whatever age, early on is thinking about it. And I would say it involves a lot of things. It involves primarily getting to know oneself, right? So self-awareness is huge. I know we do a lot of stuff on Enneagram around here. I think that's actually a good asset to use. So the way I like to think of it is GPS, right? If you get your GPS, you'll know how to navigate the world, right? So for me, GPS turns out to be 3 things. Your G is your gifts, and that's different from skills. So a lot of people are like, oh, okay, I got a few set of skills and gifts, but how do I know which is which? So I would say an example is gift, right? Like my wife, she's gifted with empathy. She's big time empathetic, right? We were sitting at a cafe once doing a little bit of work, one day, and we were taking a break, and she was just scrolling on Facebook, and literally I look over 2 minutes later, she's crying, and I'm like, what's going on, And I was like, is the coffee that bad? And I'm kidding. She's just going and she's like, I don't even remember what it was, but she was something like, did you see the news? Or 3 cats stuck in an elevator in Albania or something like that, right? And I'm like, wow, she's super empathetic, Her friends will text her, and she'll a friend will text me, and I'll be like, all right, bro, I'm going to be praying for you. And sometimes I'll forget, if I'm honest. Yeah. But she will literally stop what she's doing. She'll pray, for 2-3 minutes. And she'll text back, and she's like, don't worry, I got you. God's got you, And so she feels the person right away. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a gift she has in empathy. Now, it's no surprise that she's in mental health care, because as a mental health professional, she has the skills of active listening, where you ask questions, pull back, pause, do all that. Yeah. But no one's born with that skill, but you are born with a gift. Mm-hmm. I don't think I have the gift of empathy. I try to be as sympathetic as possible, right, when it comes to it, but I don't have that deep-seated gift. Anyone can develop a skill, right, of active listening. You go to grad school, you can learn active listening. You can do it online probably too. But can you really, you can't develop a gift. You got born with a gift, and then you put skills on top of it. So I would say don't look for skills, look for gifts. Another example is people who are entrepreneurial, like you, I think, starting this podcast and other things. There's 15% of the world are entrepreneurial. We're risk tolerant, as they say. We don't mind risk at all, right? And we invite it, in fact. We're like, all right, let's go for it, right? Yeah. 85% of humanity are risk averse. They're like, risk, I'm going to run the other way. Let me give me a stable job, right? So if you are born with the gift of risk tolerance, it might mean you can build skills of entrepreneurship, business, and all that on top of it, and learn brand marketing, hashtag marketing, all that. Those are skills. No one's born with skills, right? Obviously, no one's born out of the womb saying, I know how to hashtag market, right? But you are born with a gift of being risk tolerant, and that's a good indicator that you may or may not be a small business owner in due time. You know what I'm saying? So that's gifts, right? I'm going to take a little bit of time on this one, if that's all right. So that's gifts, right? So gifts over skills. The P is passions. People are like, oh my gosh, I don't know what my passions are because I'm just interested in too many things. Yeah. But I would say passions and interests are 2 very different things, right? So interests, right, are the things that kind of come and go with time. Passions are, in the Greek, it's what you're willing to suffer for, like Passion of the Christ, right? He suffered on our behalf. So I had a student once ask me, Park, I think I'm called to medical missions, but I'll tell you I have 0 passion for Monday Night Labs, like in biolab, right? But I'm supposed to be a medical missionary, right? So I said to her, would you rather go 3 hours every Monday, I get it, hunchback, look through a microscope, or would you go to the library and read Shakespeare for 3 hours? She's like, I don't even know how to spell Shakespeare, right? So her whole thing is she's willing to suffer for her passion because she's got a calling on her life, right? So I would say, what are you willing to suffer for? What is that thing where you're like, you know what, I know it means 2 more years of grad school, but I'm willing to do it because I got a call of God in my life, So that passion is different from interest can always come and go, right? But what's the deeper passions? And those things, again, you ask okay, how do you find your calling? I mean, self-awareness, prayer, and then mentors who can say like, you know what, that kind of a passion I don't see in most people, and they can kind of help call it out in you too, you know. So they can call out gifts as well as passions in your life. So mentoring is crucial. And the third, the S, I would say, is serving God's purposes. Now I know that could sound like just Christian needs, like, oh, okay, let's serve God, right? But if you can take your gifts and your passions, the S would be like, for example, I think one of the purposes of God in our generation is racial reconciliation. That's a big thing. I think mental health is a purpose of God that he's trying to redeem. All that to say, I don't think there are like billions of purposes. I also don't think there are like two. I think there are probably like 3, 4, 5, 6 dozen things that God is up to in our generation that he wasn't doing 50 years ago, and that he's not going to be doing, say, 50 years from now. But in our generation, how can you take your gifts, what you're born with, your passions, what you're born for, and put them in service of God's purposes? And you got that, you know, Venn diagram, the GPS. I would say that's how you can really think through your calling.
That's so good. So what do you feel is the hardest part about finding the center balance of your GPS?
I honestly think that one of the hardest things is for people to figure out what they're really passionate about. The G and the P are hard. The S, I think, just comes with like mentorship and people who can speak into like, okay, what's God up to in our generation? People who've like literally not just read the news but prayed over it for like 20, 30 years. Like, okay, this is what God is doing in our generation. The S part you can figure out with some help, some wisdom, with some other people. But the G and the P are hard. I mean, it's really hard to know what really are my gifts. Not just like some skills, but my gifts. And I think getting a sense of self-awareness is difficult. And so it takes time. It takes community to speak into it. So the thing I kind of recommend for people to do that with, especially the passion part, is there's a book by Burnett and Evans. They wrote a book called Designing Your Life, and one's a Christian, one's not, but they both teach at Stanford, and they wrote this book, and they said passion for most people come after they try something and discover they like it, and then go all in on it, right? Most people are like, oh, let me just hang out here at the beach, figure out what I'm passionate about, right? But I think it really is trial and error. And so, for example, like early on, like I guess around 30 or something, I went and I was part of this conference in the Philippines, and they invited us for this like 5-day conference actually. And long story short, we got there, long flight, landed. It was like noon, but we were gonna stay up all till evening because we wanted to fight jet lag. So we stayed up, and we're up like 24 hours at this point. We're like dead tired, but at the same time, we're like excited. So we give our like 3-hour thing. I give the last bit, and then we do a Q&A. So we're like talking 10 p.m. at this point.
Oh, gosh.
And then the MC, I finish up, the MC grabs the mic, and he's like, how many of you guys enjoyed that Q&A? And they're like, you know, yay. And then how many of you guys went that hour and a half of Q&A? And then, you know, they're like, yeah. And then I actually grabbed the mic because I was so excited. I was in it, and we were just flowing. And so I grabbed the mic back, and I was like, I would enjoy it, you know? And then my team, they're like, no, we're done. You know, we need to go back. We got 4 more days, right? But I think what I felt at that moment was, as I went back to the dorm where we were staying, I jumped on my laptop and I emailed my mentor. I said, Dave, I think I know what I was born for, right? There was this moment, I felt it like in my bones. And then he goes, even though he was in California, he wrote back that he was up at that time, difference or whatever, but he was up and he wrote back and he was like, Rich, pay attention to your body. This doesn't happen for most people in their life, if ever. Pay attention to your body. And I was like, wait a second, did Dave go Eastern mysticism on me, like New Age, like what is that, right? Yeah. But there's something true, like, I mean, because we're not just souls, we're bodies, and God has created us that way. We feel, as one person says, we feel God's pleasure when we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And so I felt that, and so it wouldn't have happened if I was just sitting on the beach trying to think through like what's my passion. But as you go about doing certain things, you will come to see like, wow, this brings me really fully alive. And I think really that's why I highly encourage internships, paid or not, you know, do as many as you can do, part-time jobs, do whatever it takes, do a gap year if needed. If you haven't figured out next steps, then in that gap year, I was telling one of my students, I remember telling her, the best way to do a gap year is do 4 internships and 2 part-time jobs. If you can do it. Like if you can do it, so you have some money to make it sustainable, but you can touch 6, 7 different industries. And as a result of that, really set yourself up for the next, you know, several decades on the front end, rather than like going in on grad school and then realizing, wait a second, that's not me. You know, there's a lot of people who do that. People go to law school, spend 2-3 years and a whole lot of money. And you're like, wait a second, I hate law, right? Or I hate law school. So they don't go and be a lawyer. But why not do that on the front end? So I would say trial and error is huge.
Yeah. How about for those that are later in their years?
Same thing. It's hard to be able to do that. Like, yeah, once you've got a mortgage and all the rest.
Yeah.
But and I think as we get older, we tend to know ourselves better. So it may not take an entire 12 months. It might just take 12 weeks. It might just take a couple of weeks. But as you take a gap from whatever you're doing, or it might be the moonlighting thing. So I've got friends who are in their 30s and 40s. One gentleman whom he's a medic. He's a doctor. He's a ER doctor. No, he's a surgeon. And as a surgeon, he went to med school and he's doing fine and he's somewhat enjoying his life as a doctor. But in himself, he's always felt like he needed to be a screenwriter in Hollywood. And he lives right here in LA. And so for him, he's always had that itch in his body to go ahead and scratch. And so he started moonlighting. He started taking these evening classes at CBS. And eventually, he wrote a couple pilots that are now getting aired. And I connected him with someone who's in Hollywood. And so the Renaissance group, as you mentioned, we're doing a lot of that. So of connecting folks like that. And so he's now moonlighting as a screenwriter, but daytime as a doctor. So I think people have to get creative, to kind of fulfill their passion. I talk about the practical and the passionate. You got to pay the bills, but you really want to end up doing the passionate full time if you can. Yeah. So sometimes it's a sliding scale. So I think if you're like 35, full-time job, mortgage, and a kid, then maybe it's more like evenings and weekends where you can carve it out versus like, let me just take a gap here. Like that might not go so well with the spouse. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I do think that life is too short to just do the practical. I think at some point you got to slide into the passionate, and people are excited around you when you're doing you're passionate about this podcast, and no one's like paying you, unless I don't know about that.
No, not at all.
But because you're passionate about it, people on campus here are also happy to come on the show with you to do it. And then even like spread about it on social, right? Because so at some point, the world and the kingdom will be lit on fire if you see people passionately doing what it. And whether that means being a software engineer to being, like an artist of some kind, let's go in on our passion, but be wise about it too. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, how do you know a calling is a calling?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, through a lot of patience and prayer and time and confirmation. This is more art than a science. I mean, I talk about the Venn diagram, feels sort of sciencey, but it's frameworks that are meant to help us get, as I like to say, 80% of the way there. But the last 20% is a soft science. It's more of an art. You got to like pray through it. You got to be in conversation. You got to get that one-off affirmation from somebody somewhere who says, man, when you did that, the way you did it, man, that just blew my mind, or that just really touched my heart. Those little touch points and confirmations, I think, will eventually help you see like, okay, this is the thing that God has got me doing, Yeah. So I think the answer to that is you're 80% sure for most things in life, But as you go through like, read a couple books, as you talk to different people, and again, we have some resources at the REN, but wherever you are, whether it's online or it doesn't have to be like through our website, but there are other places that you can get some pretty helpful things, and you can get 80% of the way there. But I would say the last 20% is really prayer and mentorship. You get someone who's twice your age or whatever, like 20 years older than you, who know plenty of other people like your age, or they might be like, hey dude, the thing that you're doing that reminds me of my nephew when he was your age, or myself, and they can see things that our friends can't see. Mm-hmm. So I always think that community is healthy when it's both horizontal and vertical. So you got peers, but then you also have mentors who can speak down into your life. And so I think that last 20% is really through mentorship and prayer and confirmation. Yeah.
How do you know if your calling is coming from God or if it's just something you feel like you want to do?
Yeah. No, that's good. And here's a short answer. Ideally, it's both. Like I'm sometimes a little bit too scared of people who are like, it's either God or it's me. Sometimes God uses your very good thoughts to get you to where He wants you to be, right? So it can be very much the one and the same, right? So I think the short answer is, why can't it be both? But I get you. Like a lot of times we're like, I don't know, like, am I wanting this new job because it's, the high pay or whatever, and it's just me who wants it, or does God actually want me to be in it? And I honestly think I use, it's a bit to get into, but I use 4 S's to kind of discern the will of God, right? Got along the scripture, the first S. Second S would be that you've got confirmation through the Spirit. And so I believe the Holy Spirit speaks to us. He speaks through other people to us as well. I'm both, as I like to say, lowercase e evangelical and lowercase p Pentecostal. I believe in the importance of the word evangelical, so scripture for sure, but also Pentecostal because I believe the Spirit speaks to us today. And so, so scripture, the Spirit, thirdly, the saints, and by that I mean just people, God's people confirming things on you. You might be listening to a radio one day, a radio sermon or something, and people speaking. I think God does speak through the radio, I know people are like, "What? That's crazy." And then the fourth S is situations. I think even in Acts 16 and Acts 18, we have Paul not going in certain directions on his mission trip because the Holy Spirit redirected and the situation didn't allow it and so forth. So there are situations, open and closed doors, that God uses to get us to where he wants us to go. So scripture, Spirit, saints, and situations. And by the way, on the saints thing, I think that includes podcasts. I think God speaks through podcasts. I know this sounds crazy. You're like, God speaks through podcasts? Yeah, absolutely. He speaks through books, right? Of course he does. The only thing I would be careful of is social media, because nowadays, whether it's Google or YouTube or Instagram, their algorithm, they listen in on a conversation. So if you're like, hey man, I'm praying about going to Haiti, and then you see it, it's an ad on, it doesn't necessarily mean God, that's just Google, right? So but podcasts are different because you download them, you listen to when and maybe the Spirit is guiding you to listen to it. So I think podcasts are a little bit different that way, but just straight social you gotta be careful, is what I'm gonna say. Yeah. Those four S's, I think, for me are helpful filters. It's not foolproof, but I think I found that pretty helpful. So then it's not just your own thought, but it's being confirmed, through those four S's.
Yeah, I think that's so important to point out, the social media aspect.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of times people can get confused if they see something on their social media.
Right.
Oh my gosh, maybe I should buy this, or maybe God is really telling me to get something.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely.
It's so interesting.
Yeah. So when I see stuff on social and I see someone like Kanye West pop up on, I feel like that's God telling me I need to connect with him. But I think that's just true. No, I'm just kidding.
And your boy Lecrae too.
Yeah, that's right. Lecrae. Shout out you. Okay.
Is there a difference between dreams and calling?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. These are all really good questions. Someone asked it the other way. I remember in a lab I was in recently. They were like, what about visions versus calling? Or dreams versus calling? Someone I was with on the panel, they put it nicely. Actually, it was Ed Lee, the founder of Wahoo's Tacos. So he's kind of connected with us at the Ren too. But he was like, I think you can have multiple visions, even if your calling is the same. So the way I like to put it is, I think calling is singular. I think it stays with you your whole life. I think context keeps shifting. So for example, I think my calling, as I like to put it, is basically to bridge a church in the academy with theology. So I'll be on a podcast, I'll write a blog or do a vlog. Those are certain contexts. I'll speak at a church or give a lecture here at the university, right? Those are different contexts. But no matter my context, I'm constantly trying to fulfill that thing of bridging the church and the academy with theology, right? So calling is singular, context continually change. Maybe one day all I'll do my whole life is full-time be a writer or something. That's fine. That's a different context. But I'm still trying to bridge the church and academy, right? Yeah. So my encouragement to folks would be, hey, find that, as I like to say, really that 8 to 15 word calling statement that you can craft and think carefully and pray it over and get that right, because then everything else will feed into it, and you'll know how to filter, through that one calling statement, But to answer your question about dreams and visions, same thing. I would say, what's your calling? Focus on that, and then the Lord, for different seasons of your life, might give you dreams and visions. Really, he might be like, hey, Joe, as your calling is X, Y, and Z, now I want you for 5 years to consider doing that in Asia. Just like Francis Chan is now moving to Asia as a result of what he feels like the Lord is having him do. For over 20 years, he was at Simi Valley pastoring a church in suburban America, Yeah. So he's got visions, but his calling is, he's going to be doing the same thing when he gets to Myanmar as he's been doing, rightly so, Yeah. And so that's why I think don't chase the dream, right? Ground yourself in the calling, and then let the Lord, put new dreams and visions in your heart as the seasons change, So I think, that's why I'm so big on calling. Once you figure out calling, my mentor, Dr. Guinness, we were in Oxford literally a week before I was finishing up and flying back here to Orange County. And he said, Rich, as you now graduate with your doctorate at Oxford, you're going to get all kinds of opportunities coming your way. And I was like, actually, a doctorate, in theology is not going to be easily hireable, right? And he's like, you're going to get a lot of opportunities. And then he said something I won't forget. Is our last lunch in Oxford. He said, be sure to be able to say no to those opportunities that aren't central to your calling. Right? And that's not easy, right? Because you get a lot of opportunities coming your way, and some of them have a nice salary attached to them or whatever. But that kept with me, and to be able to say no to the things that aren't central to your calling, I think that's when you live actually the most fulfilled and flourishing life you can. You could live a very high-paid life, but to be honest, people will be honest with you, pretty miserable, right? You can be a miserable millionaire, right? Or you can be a fulfilled, flourishing person who follows the Lord and the calling He's got on your life. But to do that, take, 6 months, a year, or whatever it takes to really discern, okay, what's that 10-word calling statement? Because that will help you filter out those things that aren't central.
Where does the 10-word calling statement stem from?
Yeah, I know. So I like to sometimes just put numbers to it to kind of just make it helpful, because, what you don't want is like an essay on your calling statement. Like, no, you're not even gonna read it, right? You're gonna be bored by yourself. But you also, I don't think you can do it in like three words, like Nike, just do it. Just do what? What's your calling, right? So that's why I think it takes somewhere around like 8, 10, 15 words to hammer out. And I actually got all these almost like 10 principles on like how to write a good calling statement. And I can kind of share that with you on a slide or something, maybe for the show notes or whatever. But I honestly do think that there's good ways of crafting a calling statement. And people are like, what is in a calling statement? Who cares if you can write it out or not? But actually, when you write things out, it gets clearer. And the clearer your thoughts are, the clearer I think your calling, your life will be, that matches up to what you're aiming at. Because if you don't have anything to aim at, you're gonna miss it, right? Yeah. So I think having a clear calling statement will give you direction. And honestly, it's the kind of thing you don't want to just be like, okay, I got it, I wrote it down. So, to be a millionaire by 25. Again, I don't know why, but that's not a calling. That's a goal that can be part of your calling. But again, why has God placed you on this earth at this time in history? What gifts and passions and what purposes are you fulfilling? And if you can get a clear calling statement, honestly, it will serve you for the next 30, 40, 50, 80 years of life. And, I think of William Wilberforce. We talked about him in class recently, but he basically said, God has put before me two great objects. One, the suppression of the slave trade, right, to get rid of slavery in the British Empire back then. And two, the reformation of manners, which basically means to make society moral again. And over the course of 40 years, he did that. And he died at the end of his life. Just right before he died, the bill was passed, and slavery was ended. So here's a man whose calling statement and life's work kind of culminated at the same time. But for us, I think we all have to, and people will look on lives like this and say, look, here's a person who was faithful to his caller and to his calling. But the only way people don't know that is if you yourself know, right, what your calling is. I don't know, it sounds like a silly analogy just came to mind right now, but that whole phrase, especially in the college world of DTR, defining the relationship, right? And that's always important, and oftentimes it's brought up by the girl, sometimes by the guy, like, hey, where are we, who are we, what are we, right? What's our status, And I think the reason people ask that is because people need definition. Yeah. People need clarity and identity. And so by having a calling statement, it's like giving yourself a DTR. What am I? What has God called me to be and to do? I think that just makes things a lot less, complicated.
Do you feel like there's an age that you have to figure out your calling by?
No, I don't. That's a good question, but, of course, God is redemptive of all our life, right? So at any point, He can bring it about. But as with anything, the sooner, as anything that's important like this, the earlier the better. Honestly, an ideal age could be like 16, 18, 20. And the reason I say that is because, as again, my mentor, he was on a podcast, Dr. Guinness, he was being interviewed, and he said, hey, one simple, super practical advice from calling, because you wrote a book on the call, what would you say, would be that one deeply, just super practical? And he would say, rather than folks figuring out calling at 26, what if at 16, they figure it out. Why? Because people go from high school to college to grad school. They're 26 years old, and they go, what am I supposed to do with my life, right? What if at 16, they figured out their calling so that their college, their major, and then their career fit in line with what they figured out on the front end. And that's why with the Ren, we're passionate about doing it at college and even younger, because then by the time they are figuring out big decisions like what should I major in, what should I go to grad school, what my internship should be, they're already trying to filter it through their calling again. So ideal is 16, 18, 20, 22, but again, I've got friends who are close to me at 42 and 62. I'm literally thinking of 2 people at 42 and 62, both of whom have said to me, Rich, I don't know what else to do with my life. And it's never too late, right? God is always redeeming things. And so whether they have 40 more years or 20 more years or whatever, God wants to use all those years. And so it's never too late.
I'm glad that you added that redeeming part, because a lot of times the thing that I tell my peers that are in college, like, we have this overwhelming pressure of trying to figure out what God has called us to for the rest of our lives. But I like to tell them sometimes that, like, don't worry, because even though if we make the wrong decision, God will redeem our wrong decision. So that kind of relieves the pressure a little bit. And you mentioned earlier a little bit that your calling follows you the rest of your life. Can your calling change?
So that's good. These are really good questions, man. Wow. I would only say it all depends on how we use our words, right? So if some people are like, oh, well, I think calling can change, because before I was like a software engineer, living for God in Silicon Valley or whatever, and now I'm doing this over here as a missionary and blah, blah, blah. Like, okay, I think that's entirely fine, but I bet that person who's now a missionary in blah, 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 wherever that is, right? Like wherever, in Kenya or Korea or whatever, in Kauai, that person is probably living for Jesus in the same kind of way, hopefully, if he did it right, as he was in Silicon Valley, if that makes sense. So my point is this: you can have a calling which I think is singular and constant if you get it right, and then again, like, your context can change. So let me think of an example, right? So actually, going back to that gentleman, Micheal Jr., who's that comedian, he says, look, I'm a comedian, but actually my purpose is to inspire people to walk in their purpose. So he'll tell jokes on stage, but he'll also write books. And then he goes, and then I'll just hang out with my friends on a Friday night. I'm still living my calling. I'm just trying to get people inspired to do their purpose, right? Or check out this lady, her name is Celeste Headley. She's not even a Christian, I don't think she is, but she gets it. On a TEDx talk, she was like, I'm an opera singer by night, but my day job is an NPR radio broadcaster. She said, but my mission is the same. She calls it mission, we call it calling. She said, my mission is the same, which is to motivate and inspire people by the power of my voice. So as an opera singer or a broadcaster, she's doing the same thing. That's what I love. She's got one calling, 2 jobs, 2 contexts, right? So over time, you can have many different contexts, many different seasons of life, and visions again as well. But you give me someone who figured out their singular mission, their singular calling, man, they're freed up to do whatever, but it always leads back to who they are. That's why I think it's so crucial to figure out gifts and passions, Like you too, Joe, like early on, as you figure out, like, man, because God has given everyone a gift. Some he's given multiple gifts to. But as you figure out, man, what's the thing that he's made me born with that I'm beginning to peer into? And then what's the thing that I'll do, even if I get paid very little or next to nothing, what's that passion that just drives me? You bring those things together, and I'm telling you, wherever you go, the world and the kingdom will be lit on fire, because they're like, man, Joe's doing this thing. And doing your thing is your calling. That's just all it is, And as you do it for the Lord, all the more.
So good. Do you think somebody can lose their calling? Is it possible to lose a calling?
I would put it this way. I think people can lose awareness of their calling. I think their calling is probably always there. It's just how connected to God are we to discern what it is. You know what I mean? So I'm not going to say calling your salvation and you can't lose yourself, but I am going to say that definitely it's a matter of awareness.
To the last 2 questions that we have, what do you think causes people to not find their calling?
That's great. That's a really good question. And if I had to point to one thing, probably, it would be back to the thing of self-awareness. We just lack self-awareness, right? So 2 stories. One involves this brilliant gentleman who's a Christian. he's really a genius over at Oxford, right? So my buddy and I, Max, we're finishing up our doctorate, and he and I, as we're finishing up, we're like, hey, once we finish our degree, what do you want to do? Like, hey, what if you and I wrote a book together, right? And we were like, what should we write on? And then we're like, let's think about it. So we were just chatting away on a Saturday night, and he's like, and we were both like, what if we wrote on like God's sovereignty and human free will? As if nobody already tackled that subject, right? We're like, hey, you do it from philosophical, I do it from theological, we'll combine our forces, we'll write that book, we'll figure it out for once and for all, right? Kind of very arrogant a little bit, right? But we're like, hey, that'd be a pretty cool topic, actually. So we thought about it. Next day, on the Sunday, we come to church, and at church is Dr. John Lennox, and who is like this guy I'm talking about, right? He's this brilliant mathematician, but also like just brilliant guy, right? And but very warm-hearted gentleman. We know him personally, and so we're like, oh, hey, John's here speaking. And so he's speaking on the book of Daniel. I don't remember all that he said, but one of the things I remember was he's like, here in the city of Oxford, we're doing some big things. Some of you guys are doing like astrophysics. Some of you guys are doing nanotechnology. We're doing all sorts of big things. Some of you guys are doing theology and thinking big thoughts, right? Yeah. And then he goes, some of you are specifically thinking about, for example, the problem of God's sovereignty and human free will. And that's great for some of you. Others of you shouldn't be thinking about that because it's not your calling. And then he points right at me and Matt. No, I'm just kidding. That'd be crazy, right? But basically, it was just staggering that he would even do that, right? In the middle of his sermon, he said the thing that Max and I were just talking about. And so at lunch, Max and I and then our wives were there, and we're like, hey, wasn't that interesting that like John, like, cause we hadn't told him anything. It was like Saturday night. But he just basically did that, right? And so we're like, wow, that kind of gave us pause, right? So what's my point? In Romans 12:3, Paul says, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, right? But think of yourself with sober judgment. In other words, be self-aware. Now, I would encourage some folks who I think have the opposite problem, but the outcome is the same. They think too lowly of themselves than they ought. But the problem is still the same, which is they lack self-awareness. Some of them need to go from, oh, I can't do anything, to like, wait a second, you're up here, to I can do everything, wait a second, you're over here, right? So it's self-awareness. So the second story is this. I have a friend who's a child psychiatrist, right? So she's been working in analyst psychiatry for a long time now. And I was hanging out with her on a Saturday, I think it was on a Saturday random weekend. And I was just chatting, and I was like, hey, and then I just asked her, I was like, hey, I'm getting to write this talk for the youth on this one thing at this church. Quick question for you. Out of all your years of working with teens, what would you wish on like every 14-year-old in America, so that literally like in 10 years time, when they're 24, they wouldn't necessarily have to visit your office as a psychiatrist. Like how do you put yourself out of a job is what I was asking, right? But honestly, like, how do we help the youth to do well through the years of mental health and all that, right? Like they don't struggle as much. And I was like, she's like, one or two things? I was like, yeah, just one or two things, And then she goes, she thought about it for like half a minute. She's like, she said two things. I'll just share the first thing she said. She goes, identity. If they figure out who they are and what God has called them to do in their life, sex, drugs, and all other kinds of things, they're just not going to be as interested in those things in the wrong way, because they've got a call of God on their life, and they're just wrapped up in that, if they figure out who they are. So self-awareness. I think people, to your question, won't get calling very well if they're not self-aware. And again, how do you get self-awareness? I would say GPS. I would say through mentorship, figuring out, as I like to say, passions, what you enjoy doing, gifts, what others enjoy you doing. Like, to me, that is a good formula for figuring out, okay, this is what I was made for. So I think self-awareness is key to so much of life.
Yeah, I feel like that's important. The self-awareness part is key, because I feel like as a college student or a young adult, like I want somebody to tell me what am I called to do. We want people to tell us.
Yeah,
but
right.
it's a self-discovery thing.
Yes.
It takes time.
Absolutely.
And we don't want to invest that time. So
Right. It's hard work. Yeah.
Is.
And I think mentors are there to guide, but you're right, ultimately, it's got to be discerned between oneself and the Lord ultimately, with some input, but you gotta be so convinced, like William Wilberforce, he got a call of God in his life, and it changed history, right?
Yeah.
And so, so what is that thing that God has given us, each of us?
Yeah. So the last question.
Yeah.
How does calling connect to culture?
Good question. Honestly, the short answer is through the Renaissance or nonprofit. But that's our slogan, right? Connecting calling to culture. The reason we like to say that is, I teach theology here, right, at Vanguard, which I love, and I'm so grateful for this job. And one of the things theologians believe, and a lot of people believe in general, is that we become what we believe.
Yeah.
So if you believe certain things, you'll become that kind of a person, right? So if belief matters, then doctrine and theology hugely are important, right? So we become what we believe. But I also think because humans aren't just brains, we don't just believe things with our heads, we actually are moved by our heart. So I think we actually also become what we behold. And to be honest, today what we're holding is this. Yeah. We're beholding what's on social. We're beholding all kinds of things in Hollywood and everywhere else. And it's not a bad thing. So if it's just true that we become, I think of the young boy who wants to be a pitcher when he grows up, and he just watches like Clayton Kershaw or whoever, right? Yeah. Throwing the ball. He understands, without even saying it, he understands intuitively that if he just watches that on repeat enough times, he's gonna throw like Clayton one day, right? So he's gonna become what he's constantly beholding. Or think of the young girls who watches his mom put on makeup, right? She mimics her because the more she watches her, she's gonna become this beautiful person just like her mom, right? So I think in the same way, whatever we're beholding, we're gonna become that way. So for the Ren, we're thinking, well then why not put out beautiful culture so that we become beautiful people? And again, the only way that's going to happen is when, as in class, I love to point to people like Steph Curry or Lecrae or whoever, the dentist who loves the Lord, because when we go to the dentist and we're beholding a man with great character, a woman with great character, who's doing excellent work, but also, has like Christian music playing, or whatever it is, I'm not trying to be cheesy, but whatever the thing is, gosh, we just need people who are excellent in their field, and then those people will create that beautiful culture. But the only way they're going to be excellent in their field is if they know what their field is. Yeah. So that's why calling to culture. Yeah.
So good.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts?
No. I mean, I think folks, I would just encourage them to do the whole thing, as I like to say, lowercase, but evangelical and Pentecostal. Like, be people of a word, be thoughtful, read books on this stuff, and so forth. But then be Pentecostal. Be really open to the voice of the Spirit, because you can read 100 books but still not get calling. Yeah. I think you really need both. I think we need to recognize and resource and respect the Word, and we need to recognize and resource and respect the Spirit. And when those come together, then I think that's a recipe for a great life well lived.
That's so good. Well, thank you so much again for joining us.
Joe. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at LTwithaCupofJoe@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram at LTCupofJoe. And make sure to tune in the second Thursday of every month for a new podcast. Thank you for tuning in again. And remember, even the little things make a difference.